The disc was cold when I first touched it. Not the ordinary cold of metal left in a shaded stall, but a deeper cold, the kind that comes from something that has been waiting too long in the wrong hands. The vendor, a Vethali with 4 arms, and the patience of someone who had been alive for 200 years, held it up in one of those arms and said 3 credits with the tone of a being who expected me to walk away. I did not walk away. That was either the best decision I have ever made or the most dangerous one. 6 weeks later, I still cannot decide which. My name is Marin Cole. I am 31 years old, human, and the only member of my species within 6 sectors of Vethali Station. I run cargo, not the glamorous kind, not weapons or diplomatic pouches or anything worth stealing. I haul machine parts, food stocks, cheap textiles, and occasionally chemical compounds that smell terrible and pay barely enough to cover the smell. My ship is a mid-range hauler called the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh has seen better decades. I keep her flying through stubbornness and a very good relationship with a Koran mechanic who owes me 3 favors. That is my life. That was my life anyway. I had arrived at Vethali Station 2 days ahead of my cargo pickup. That was my fault. I had miscalculated the transit window and arrived early, which left me with time, no money to spend on anything useful, and a station that smelled like engine coolant and something I could never identify but always associated with the color gray. I wandered because wandering cost nothing. Vethali Station is built in layers, and the lower layers are where the real market lives. Not the licensed vendors with proper display cases and currency terminals. The real market, where people sell what they found, what they made, and what they had no business selling in the first place. I was looking for food. I ended up in the scrap row. The scrap row is exactly what it sounds like. Long, low tables covered in broken equipment, dead components, stripped housings, cracked navigation arrays, melted processor units, things that had once served a purpose and no longer did. The vendors who worked this row were patient people. They had to be. Most of what they sold would never move. I had walked past a dozen stalls before the Vethali, with the 4 arms caught my attention, not because he said anything to me, but because he was holding something up to the thin station light and turning it slowly, the way you turn something when you are not sure you understand it. I stopped. It was a disc, maybe 8 centimeters across, made of a dark alloy I could not name. The surface was not smooth. It was etched. Not scratched or worn, but deliberately etched. Lines and symbols cut with precision into the metal, running in patterns that almost looked like they repeated and then did not. Through the etching, and inside it somehow, there were threads of what looked like glass, fused into the metal itself, running in thin branching paths like the veins in a leaf. The threads were dark. The whole object was dark. But when the light caught it at a particular angle, the threads caught it too, and there was something inside them. Not a reflection exactly, more like a depth. The vendor said 3 credits. I said 2. He said 3. I gave him 3 credits and put the disc in the inside pocket of my coat. It sat there, against my ribs, as I finally found food 3 stalls over and ate something that was probably not technically meat, but tasted close enough to not worry about. It sat there as I walked back through the upper levels and checked in with the cargo coordinator, a Koran female named Sessa, who talked fast and billed slow. It sat there, warm from my body heat now. As I boarded the Pharaoh and filed my departure prep, I was not thinking about it. I had bought stranger things at worse prices and sold most of them at a loss. I did not think about it again until my hand brushed the pocket while I was reaching for my navigation stylus. The disc was warm, not from my body, not residual heat from being pressed against my ribs. It was warm the way something is warm when it is generating warmth from inside. I took it out and held it in my palm. It pulsed. One time. A single, slow, inward breath of light through those glass threads. So brief that I almost decided I had imagined it. But I had not imagined it. My hand knew the difference between still and moving. Something in that disc had moved. I set it on the navigation console and looked at it for a long time. It sat there and did nothing else. I picked it up again. Nothing. Put it down. Nothing. Picked it up with my left hand instead. Nothing. Switched back to my right hand, and this time I held it longer. wrapping my fingers around it so the metal was in full contact with my palm, and I counted to 30. At 24, it pulsed again. I said something under my breath that I will not repeat here. Then I set the disc down very carefully in the center of my navigation console, finished my departure sequence, and got the Pharaoh clear of Vithali Station. I had cargo to collect and a schedule to keep. The disc could wait, but I did not stop thinking about it. Sessa had given me a 3-day transit window to reach the pickup point at Relay 11. 3 days is a long time to be alone in a ship with a question you cannot answer. I ran standard checks. I logged my flight data. I ate twice, slept once, and spent the rest of the time sitting at my console with the disc in my hand, trying to understand what it was doing and why it was only doing it for me. The third pulse came 6 hours out from Vithali. This time it lasted longer, maybe 2 full seconds. And it was not just the threads that lit up. The etchings lit up too. Every line, every symbol, sharp and blue-white, as if the metal itself had become glass for a moment. I held very still. I did not breathe. The disc sat in my palm and glowed, and then it stopped. I set it down and picked up my personal recorder. I said, "Object acquired at Vithali Station Scrap Market, Stall Row 7. Vendor species Vithali. Paid 3 credits. Size approximately 8 centimeters in diameter. Alloy unknown. Etched surface with what appears to be a script or notation system. Internal threading of a transparent material. Possibly glass or glass compound. Fused to the alloy. Object responds to sustained physical contact with what appears to be a light emission event. Activation requires direct skin contact. Unknown mechanism. Unknown origin. Further observation required." I ended the recording, tucked the disc back into my coat pocket, and went to pick up my cargo. The pickup was routine. The cargo was 12 sealed containers of agricultural filtration components, bound for a colony station 2 sectors away. Heavy, dull, legal. I loaded them, signed the transfer documentation, and got back underway. That should have been the entirety of my next week. Load, haul, deliver, get paid, find the next job. That is the cycle. That is how it works. But the disc pulsed 4 more times on the way out of the relay, each time a little longer, each time a little brighter, and by the 4th time, I had the distinct feeling that it was not just reacting to me. It was trying to tell me something. Not in any language I knew, not in any format I recognized. But the pattern had changed. The symbols lit up in a sequence now. The same sequence each time, starting from the outer edge and spiraling inward. And the final symbol to light was the one at the very center of the disc, a shape I could not name but could not stop looking at. I knew what curiosity felt like. I had always been too curious for my own comfort. I also knew, somewhere deep and practical, that an object this old and this specific did not end up in a scrap bin by accident. Someone had put it there, or someone had lost it, or someone had been very desperate to get rid of it without anyone knowing. None of those options made me feel comfortable, but I kept it. I held it in my palm in the dark of the pilot seat, while the stars moved slowly past the forward glass, and I thought about what it might mean to be the only person in 6 sectors who could make it light up. I thought it probably meant something. I just did not yet know what. The Pharaoh hummed around me, quiet and steady, doing what she had always done, and the disc sat warm in my hand, patient as something that has been waiting a very long time, and I had the clear, cold, certain feeling that my ordinary life had just become something else entirely. I had paid 3 credits for it. I was starting to think that price was going to seem very funny later. On the 2nd day after leaving Relay 11, I had a full conversation with the disc, and it did not say a single word back. I am not a person who talks to objects as a rule. I grew up practical. My mother was a logistics coordinator, and my father repaired atmospheric processors, and neither of them had much patience for behavior they could not explain by function. Sentimentality was not a household currency, but I had been alone in the Pharaoh for long enough that I had developed small habits, and one of those habits was narrating my own observations out loud when I was trying to think through a problem. It helped me hear what I was actually thinking, rather than just cycling through the same loop of incomplete thoughts. So I held the disk in my left hand, put my right elbow on the console, rested my chin on my fist, and I said, "All right, let us figure out what you are." The disk pulsed. I had started to expect that. What I had not expected was what happened 12 seconds later. The threads lit first, all of them together, not in sequence but simultaneously. A sudden bloom of light that filled my palm and threw faint shadows up my arm. Then the etchings lit, sharp and clear, every line distinct. And then something lifted. It is the only word I have for it. Something in the disk lifted, separated from the surface, expanded upward into the air above my palm, and became a projection. I did not move for a long time. It was a star map, three-dimensional, slowly rotating, hovering in the space above my hand at a height of roughly 30 centimeters. The stars were represented as small points of white light, color-coded in a way I did not immediately understand, connected by lines that suggested distances or relationships or both. It was detailed. It was precise. And somewhere near the outer edge, a single coordinate blinked. Not a star. An empty point in space, marked by a blinking symbol I recognized from the disk's etching. My recorder was already running. I had learned to keep it running. I sat very still and let the map rotate. I counted the stars I could identify against what I knew of the charts for this region. Most of them matched. Some did not match any designation I knew. The coordinate that blinked was in a gap between two systems I recognized, a stretch of space that the public navigation charts listed as unregistered transit space. Nothing there, nothing near there, nothing worth going near. The map rotated once, twice, 3 times, and then the disk dimmed, and the projection folded back down and disappeared. I sat with it in my hand for another few minutes, thinking. Then I called Delta Sev. Delta Sev was not easy to describe and even harder to explain. He was a broker in the oldest sense of the word, which meant he sold information and connections rather than physical goods, and he operated out of a neutral relay that technically belonged to no government and practically belonged to whoever paid for it that week. We had worked together 3 times. Once he had helped me find a cargo contract when I was nearly broke. Once I had carried a sealed package for him that I had enough sense not to ask about. Once he had given me a warning about a route that later turned out to have saved my ship and probably my life. I did not consider us friends. I considered us useful to each other, which was a more durable relationship. His face appeared on my comm screen looking the way it always looked, composed and a little tired, like someone who had seen too many things and was making peace with that fact. I told him what I had. Not all of it. I told him I had picked up a disc at a scrap market on Vithali Station, that it displayed a star map under certain conditions, and that the map contained a coordinate I could not find in any public registry. I described the etchings. I described the threading in the metal. I described the symbols as clearly as I could, without the ability to transmit the image directly, because I was not going to transmit the image directly until I understood what I had. Delta Sev listened. He was good at listening. He let me finish without interrupting, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me 2 questions. He asked me where I had acquired it, and he asked me exactly how it activated. I told him about the scrap bin. I told him about the skin contact. There was a pause. 16 minutes. 40 seconds. I counted because I had nothing else to do, and because the length of a silence tells you a lot about what a person is thinking. Delta Sev did not go silent for 16 minutes over small things. When he came back, his voice was flat. Not the flat of someone who has bad news. The flat of someone who is working very hard to sound neutral. He told me to sell it. He told me to take whatever offer came first and not negotiate, and not explain what it did, and not demonstrate it for anyone. He told me to get it out of my possession as quickly as possible, and not to transmit any record of what I had told him. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because the people who lost it are the kind of people who do not accept that something is gone." I said, "What kind of people are those?" He said, "The kind who have the resources to make you gone instead." I said, "What is it?" He was quiet for another moment. Then he said the symbols I had described were a pre-compact script. He said the civilization that used that script was so old that most of the current galactic governments had agreements in place to suppress the academic record of it, not because it was violent or dangerous in any historical sense, but because the legal implications of acknowledging its existence in full were more than anyone in power wanted to deal with. He said the disk was not a relic, not a decoration, not a navigation aid in the ordinary sense. He said it was a key. He used that word specifically. A key. He did not say what it opened. I thanked him. I ended the call. I made a second recording of the entire conversation from memory, with timestamps, and I transmitted it encrypted to 3 separate archive addresses that I maintained under names that were not my own. This was a habit I had developed 2 years earlier after a cargo dispute that had nearly cost me the Pharaoh, and it was a habit that had never cost me anything. Then I sat in the dark and thought, I am not a bold person by temperament. I am careful, I plan. I calculate risk the way my father calculated load tolerances, methodically and with a margin built in. I have never in my life made a decision that I could not explain in plain terms on a bad day in front of a government official. I understand that most of the situations people get into could have been avoided if they had just taken a single step back and thought for 30 seconds. I took 30 seconds. And at the end of 30 seconds, the thing I knew with complete certainty was this. Delta Sev had been frightened. He had tried to hide it, and he had nearly succeeded. But the 16-minute silence had been fear, not calculation. Delta Sev did not frighten easily. The fact that he was frightened told me more than anything he had actually said. It told me that the disk was worth more than I could currently imagine. It also told me that someone was going to come looking for it, regardless of whether I kept it or sold it, because whoever had lost it did not know it had been sold already. It had been sitting in a scrap bin. That meant someone did not know where it was, and once they figured out where it had gone, they would trace it forward. The only safety I had was in knowing more than they did, faster than they could catch up. I pulled up my star charts and began cross-referencing the coordinate from the map, not the public charts. I had a secondary set I had purchased from a cartography black market 2 years ago. Older data, pre-compact survey records that the licensed chart companies did not include in their standard packages. I had bought them on a vague professional instinct that old information was sometimes worth more than new information when you operated in frontier sectors. The coordinate existed in the old charts, just barely. It was listed as an unverified survey point, tagged with a notation code I had to look up. The code, when I found its definition in the archive index, said, Spatial anomaly, classification pending, survey incomplete. Survey incomplete meant someone had gone there, had found something that did not fit their models, and had not gone back to finish the work. Or had not been allowed to. I set the coordinate as a secondary waypoint in my navigation system, saved it under a file name that meant nothing, and kept flying toward my delivery. I had cargo to drop, I had a schedule, and I had a small, warm disk in my coat pocket that was becoming, with every passing hour, the most important object I had ever owned. I thought about Delta Sev's voice on that call, the flatness of it, the effort behind the flatness. I thought about the vendor at the scrap stall, turning the disk in the light, not knowing what he had. 3 credits. Somewhere in the arithmetic of this situation, I was going to find out what 3 credits had actually bought. I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that. I was not afraid because fear in a situation like this was not useful. What was useful was information, and documentation, and a very clear head. I started a new file on my personal system. I labeled it Disk, Ongoing, and I began to write down everything I knew. 2 things arrived at nearly the same time, the way trouble usually does. The first was a hailing signal from a Corin vessel. The second was an approach notice from an unregistered private ship. I picked up both of them within 11 minutes of each other while I was 3 hours out from my delivery point, and I knew immediately that neither of them was a coincidence. The Corin vessel was a mid-range government cutter, clean lines, official markings, the kind of ship that says we have authority before it says anything else. It opened a channel, and the voice that came through was precise and clipped, the way Corin voices tend to be when they are speaking a common language they consider beneath them. The speaker identified herself as Cultural Recovery Officer Nessa Var, and she said that the Corin Cultural Protection Directorate had been notified of the unauthorized removal of a protected archaeological item from a sealed excavation record, and that the item was believed to be in my possession, and that under the Compact Cultural Recovery Act, Section 14, I was required to surrender the item immediately for return to proper custody. I asked her to transmit the documentation. She said the documentation was classified at a level above what she could transmit on an open channel. I said that was very interesting, and that I looked forward to reviewing it when she could provide it, and that in the meantime, I had a cargo delivery to complete, and I wished her a productive duty shift. She did not like that. She told me to hold position. I told her I was in registered transit on a filed cargo route, and that holding position without a lawful intercept order issued through the Compact Transit Authority would constitute an interference with commercial navigation, which was a separate offense under a different section of the Compact Code, and that she was welcome to pursue the proper channels, and I would respond in full at that time. There was silence on the channel while she considered that. The second ship was already on approach by the time I finished that conversation. No official markings, no registered identifier on the automatic broadcast. Just a vessel, sleek and fast, that had appeared from a direction that suggested it had been waiting. It opened a channel without being asked, and the person who spoke was a man with a calm voice and a pleasant manner, the kind of manner that takes a long time to develop and is never entirely sincere. He said his name was Carr, just Carr. He said he represented parties who had an interest in an object I had recently acquired, and that those parties were prepared to offer compensation that he was confident I would find meaningful. He named a figure. I did not say anything for a moment, because the figure he named was not the kind of number you respond to immediately if you want anyone to respect you afterward. It was the kind of number that buys a planet's freight infrastructure. It was the kind of number that changes what the word comfortable means. I said I was not aware of having anything of particular interest to outside parties. He said that was understandable, and that he was happy to discuss it further at my convenience. I said I had a delivery to complete, and I would be in touch. He said he would be nearby. I closed both channels and sat for a moment with my hands flat on the console. I was not panicking. Panic does not help. What I did instead was think through what I actually knew about the situation I was in. I had an object that a Koran government agency claimed was stolen archaeological property from a sealed excavation. I had a private buyer with no name and no registration who was prepared to spend more money than I had ever seen in one place to acquire it. And I had a broker who had told me to get rid of it immediately, and had been frightened when he said it. What I needed was time. Time and information, specifically in that order. I had been good at buying time since I was 14 years old, and negotiating curfew extensions with my father. I opened a channel back to Nessa Var and told her I was prepared to cooperate fully with the cultural recovery process, and that I would contact the Compact Transit Authority to arrange a formal documentation review at the next registered neutral station, which I could reach in approximately 48 hours given my current cargo obligations. I said this with the particular tone of someone who has read the regulations and knows exactly where the margins are. She said that was acceptable, but that she would remain in escort range until the matter was resolved. I said I understood completely and ended the channel. I did not contact Carr again. I let him follow at his stated distance. I made a note of his approach trajectory and the approximate size and class of his vessel and added it to my disk file. Then, while I flew the last 3 hours to my delivery point and unloaded 12 containers of agricultural filtration components in the most boring and procedurally correct way I had ever unloaded anything, I spent the time doing something I had been meaning to do since the second activation. I had been in contact with the disk every day. I held it. I observed the projections. I noted the sequences. But I had not yet asked myself the obvious question, the one that Delta Sev's comment about activation had quietly introduced, and that had been sitting in the back of my mind since. He had asked me exactly how it activated. Not what it showed. Not what it did. How it activated. Skin contact. My skin. I had assumed that was simply the mechanism. Touch activated. Reasonable enough for an old device designed for regular handling. But what if the activation was not about touch in general? What if it was about touch specifically? I went to my cargo manifest database and pulled up every piece of biological classification data I had on Koran and Vithali physiology. I was not a biologist, but I had spent 8 years in frontier cargo, and I had picked up a working knowledge of the species I dealt with regularly, partly because it was professionally useful, and partly because the same curiosity that had bought a strange disc for 3 credits had driven me to read whatever I could find about the universe I was moving through. Corrin biology, silicon-adjacent cellular structure, low internal temperature regulation, nervous system distributed rather than centralized, no standard bioelectric field in the mammalian sense, Vethely biology, carbon-based but cold-blooded in the earth science sense, extremely low metabolic electrical output, nerve conduction primarily chemical rather than electrical. I found a paper in my archive, an old xenobiological comparative study I had downloaded 3 years ago because it had been free and I had been bored, and I read through the section on bioelectric field generation across known sapient species. The study was 12 years old and the data was not complete, but it was clear enough on one point. The production of a consistent, warm-blooded bioelectric field of the type generated by human nervous systems was, among the documented sapient species of the compact and its surrounding regions, essentially unique to humans and 2 other species, one of which was extinct, and one of which lived exclusively in a region 15 sectors away. I held the disk in my palm and let it pulse. I thought about that for a long time. I was the only human within 6 sectors. I was the only being with a human nervous system within 6 sectors. Every Corrin official, every Vethely vendor, every crew member on Car's unmarked ship. None of them could hold this disk and make it do what it was doing in my hand right now. The disk was not just a key, it was a key that only certain hands could turn. I had been spending my energy worrying about whether I could keep the disk. I had not yet asked whether the disk had, in some mechanical and very old sense, already chosen who it was going to work for. I opened my navigation system and looked at the filed flight plan I had on record. My next registered route took me towards Sector 9 delivery contacts, 2 systems away, in exactly the opposite direction from the blinking coordinate on the star map. I filed a small amendment. A detour. A supply stop at a fuel depot along a route that happened to run adjacent to the region of the old survey point. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked like intent, just a courier making a practical navigation choice. Nessa Var would follow me. Carr would follow me. And neither of them would be able to do what I could do when I got to wherever the disk was trying to take me. I put the Pharaoh on the adjusted heading and let the autopilot take over. Then I sat back and looked at the disk in my palm, the glow of it faint in the cabin light, the symbols cycling through their sequence, steady and patient and very, very old. I had made worse bets. I had never made one that felt this much like the universe was pointing me in a specific direction, and simply waiting to see if I would walk. I walked. The fold was not on any chart I had ever seen, and I had been looking at charts since I was old enough to reach a navigation console. It was not a jump point. Jump points have a signature, a gravitational tell, a slight distortion in the local field that standard sensors pick up and flag for the pilot. What the disk led me to was different. It was a compression, a place where space was folded, very slightly, in a way that did not read as a natural phenomenon, and did not read as an artificial one either, because whatever had made it was old enough that the equipment built to detect artificial structures did not know what category to put it in. I found it because the disk told me where to look, not in words, in behavior. 3 hours out from the coordinate, the projection had shifted. The star map had reduced itself to a single blinking point, much closer now, and a second element had appeared alongside it. A line. Not a line between 2 stars. A line between a point in space and a depth. The disk was not just showing me where to go. It was showing me how to enter. I had disconnected my automatic distress beacon. I had done this once before in my career, during the cargo dispute I mentioned, and I had always felt the weight of that decision as the kind of thing a careful person does not do lightly. I turned off the beacon now with the same weight and the same reasoning. There are situations where being findable is not in your interest, and this was one of them. Nessa Var's cutter was 2 hours behind me. Carr's ship was following her at a careful distance, watching her, which meant neither of them was watching me closely enough. The false supply stop had given me a 6-hour gap. 6 hours was enough if I moved now. I followed the line the disk drew. The Pharaoh shuddered once. A single slow tremor through her whole hull, and then the stars outside shifted. Not dramatically. They did not spin or blur or do anything cinematic. They simply moved, each one a fraction of a degree from where it had been, as if someone had turned the universe by a small and precise amount. I checked my instruments. My position had changed. I had not engaged the drive. I had not fired a single thruster. I had moved without moving. I stayed calm. Calm was a choice, the same as it always was, and I chose it deliberately the way I chose most things. What I saw on the other side of the fold was not a system. There was no star, no planet, no debris field, none of the usual furniture of deep space. There was an object. It was large, not planetary large, but large the way a city is large when you are standing a few streets away from it and looking at it for the first time. It was roughly cylindrical, wider in the middle, narrowing at both ends, and its surface was covered in the same etching pattern as the disk. The same lines, the same symbols, the same branching glass threads, but at a scale that turned decoration into architecture. The threads caught the ambient light from the distant stars and ran it through the structure, and the whole surface had a faint internal illumination, not bright, just present, the way a lamp looks from outside a window on a dark night. It was not a ship. It was not a station in any design I had ever encountered. It was a structure built for a specific purpose, and that purpose was not habitation or travel or commerce. It was storage. The shape of it said storage, the same way the shape of a box says storage. Something in the proportions, in the absence of windows, in the single large opening at the wider end, sealed by a door that was itself a single piece of the same dark alloy, covered edge to edge in etchings. The door was sealed, closed for a very long time, to judge by the absolute stillness of everything around it. I brought the Pharaoh in slowly. I matched the orientation the disk seemed to suggest, the projection changing as I moved, the line adjusting, pointing not at the center of the structure, but at a specific point on the sealed door, a section that glowed slightly brighter than the rest. I put on my suit, not because I was going outside, but because if something went wrong, I wanted to have made the sensible choice. I took the disk in my bare hand. I opened the Pharaoh's forward access hatch, which put me in the small decompression vestibule between the cabin and the exterior, close enough to the door of the structure that I could extend my arm through the open exterior hatch and reach the glowing section. I held the disk against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then everything happened. The etching lines on the door lit up, section by section, starting from the point where the disk touched and spreading outward in all directions, filling the door in a pattern that was not random and not slow. It was fast and it was deliberate, and it was beautiful, in the way that something is beautiful when it has been designed with complete precision, and you are seeing it function for the first time in a very long time. The light reached every edge of the door, and then the door moved. Not swinging open, not sliding aside, it folded. The sections of it compressed inward, each one folding against the next, the whole enormous piece reducing itself in less than 10 seconds to a ring around the opening, every folded section glowing, a threshold lit by the light of its own mechanism. Beyond it was a corridor. I retracted my arm. I closed the exterior hatch. I guided the Pharaoh through the opening. The corridor was large enough for my ship with room on both sides. The walls were the same etched alloy, but here the etchings were different. They were organized differently. The symbols on the disk were a pattern, abstract, compressed, the way a key is compressed compared to the lock it opens. The symbols on these walls were language. I did not know how I knew that. I knew the way you know, when you are standing in a library versus standing in a hallway. Something in the density of it, the organization, the sense that every mark was carrying a load of meaning. The corridor led to a chamber. I will not tell you I was prepared for it, because I was not. No amount of careful thinking prepares you for the particular feeling of entering a room that contains something no one living has seen, and understanding, all at once, what you are looking at. The chamber was circular, high-ceilinged, and arranged in rings. Each ring was a series of storage units, floor to ceiling, sealed with the same alloy and the same etchings. At the center of the room was a plinth, and on the plinth was a projection, already active, not waiting for the disk this time but simply on, a slow rotating display of information, in the pre-compact script, that I could not read, but that I recognized now as being organized the same way information was organized in any archive I had ever used. There were indices, there were cross-references, there were what looked like map coordinates embedded in descriptive text. There were records, thousands and thousands of records, arranged with the care of something that had been put here to be found by exactly the right person, at exactly the right time. I activated my recorder. I set it to continuous, and then I walked slowly around the perimeter of the chamber and I recorded everything. Not the contents. I could not read the contents. What I recorded was the existence, the structure, the dimensions, the number and arrangement of storage units, the projection at the center, the light from the walls, the quality of the air, which my suit told me was breathable and clean, and had been maintained by something that was still running, after an amount of time I could not yet calculate. Then I stopped at the plinth and looked at the central projection more carefully, because there was one section of it that I could partially read, not the pre-compact text, but a series of coordinates embedded in what appeared to be a legal declaration of some kind. And the coordinates matched a region I knew, not the blinking point from the star map, not this pocket of compressed space, but 11 specific star systems in the current compact's registered territory. Systems with names I knew, systems with populations and governments and economies. The declaration surrounded those coordinates. The declaration was filed around those coordinates, the way a legal document wraps a claim. I photographed every section of the central projection. I did it 3 times from 3 different angles. Then I walked back to the Pharaoh, sat in my pilot seat, and looked at the image I had captured of that declaration. I was not a legal scholar, but I had spent 8 years dealing with compact cargo law, transit law, salvage law, and commercial contract law, and I had read enough of the foundational documents to understand the structure of a territorial filing under the pre-compact treaty framework. What I was looking at was a legitimate, documented, and legally filed territorial claim, registered under a treaty framework that predated the current compact. A framework that, as Delta Sev had told me, had never been formally nullified. The claim covered 11 star systems, 11 populated, active, economically significant star systems. The claim was filed in the name of a civilization that most of the compact's governments officially pretended did not exist. I sat with that for a very long time. I let it settle. I let myself understand what it meant. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but practically. What it meant for the compact, what it meant for the governments of those 11 systems, what it meant for anyone who held this archive and knew what was in it. Then I stood up, went back into the chamber, and resealed every storage unit I had not opened. I had not opened any of them. I had not taken a single object. I had not disturbed a single thing. I sealed the Pharaoh's access hatch. I guided her back through the corridor. The door folded itself shut behind me, the light fading back to the quiet ambient glow, the disk cooling slightly in my palm as the structure returned to its long patience. I flew back through the fold. I filed a new recording. I described the chamber, the structure, the projection, the declaration. I encrypted it. I transmitted it to 6 archive addresses. I set a time delay on a 7th copy addressed to the Compact Academic Historical Registry in my name. Then I made a list of everything I was going to need. Legal standing was first. The rest would follow. I filed the salvage claim before I called anyone. This was not impulsive. I had been composing it in my head since I guided the Pharaoh back through the fold, running through the language of the Compact Salvage Rights Ordinance section by section, finding the right framework, the right classifications, the right terminology for a discovery that had no existing category. Found property. The disk. Location of acquisition documented. Paid price documented. No prior registered ownership in compact records. Salvage discovery. The structure. Coordinates filed. Entry documented. No prior registered claim in compact records. Discoverer. Marin Cole. Registered commercial courier. License number recorded. Ship registration recorded. Authenticated operator of the sole known access mechanism. Also me. I transmitted the claim to the Compact Civil Registry, to the Salvage Rights Arbitration Board, and to the Compact Historical Preservation Commission simultaneously, with full timestamps and with the encrypted confirmation codes that the transmission system generated automatically. 3 separate institutions, 3 separate timestamps. The claim existed now in the official record the way a fact exists when enough witnesses have seen it. Then I opened a 3-way channel. I added Nessa Var. I added Kar's vessel. And then I opened a line to Delta Sev as well, because I owed him the courtesy of knowing how this was going, and because having an informed witness on the call was worth more than any other tactical advantage I could think of. I said, "Good afternoon. I have some things to share with all of you." Nessa Var began to speak. I waited until she had finished the first two sentences, which were both forms of legal authority. And then I said, "Officer Var, I have transmitted all relevant documentation to the Compact Civil Registry under a formal discovery claim filed 32 minutes ago, timestamp verified. The Cultural Recovery Act, Section 14, which you referenced previously, applies specifically to items removed from a designated sealed excavation site on a registered world or registered compact territory. The stall at the Vethali Station Market is not a designated excavation site. It is not registered in the CRA database. I checked. The vendor had no documentation of origin for the item, which means there is no established chain of custody connecting the item to any excavation record. Section 14 does not apply to my acquisition." She was quiet. I moved on. I said, "The structure I have located and documented is registered under my salvage claim. It is not on any world. It is not in any registered compact territory. It is in open space within a spatial compression pocket, not listed in any current navigation chart. Compact jurisdiction in open unregistered space requires a specific legal framework that does not currently exist for this type of discovery, which means the appropriate body to manage the site is the Compact Historical Preservation Commission, under the terms of its founding charter, specifically Article 7, which allows for the temporary administrative protection of sites of extraordinary historical significance pending a full legal framework review." I sent a copy of Article 7 to Nessa Var's terminal. I said, "Kar, or whoever you represent, I understand you have made a substantial financial offer for the item in my possession. I want you to understand several things. First, the item is currently registered as found property in my name. Second, its function depends on a biological characteristic specific to my species and to two others, one extinct and one unavailable. Your clients cannot operate it without me. Third, the archive it provides access to is now documented in multiple independent registry systems and cannot be made to disappear. Purchasing the disk does not give your clients control of the archive. It gives them an object." There was a pause on Kar's end that told me the person on the other side of it was doing exactly the calculation I wanted them to do. I said, "What I am proposing is this. The structure should become neutral administered territory, not Koran territory, not private property. A compact administered site, overseen by the Historical Preservation Commission, with full academic access, managed transparently, with a record open to any institution that applies through proper channels. The archive belongs to history, not to any government or any buyer." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "My role in this, going forward, is as consulting authenticator. The disk remains in my possession as the mechanism of access. I am the authenticated operator. Any formal access to the site is coordinated through me at a standard consulting rate, to be negotiated with the Commission. This is not an ultimatum. This is a practical solution to a situation where every other option leads to a legal dispute that none of you can win quickly." Nessa Var said, "This is not within your authority to propose." I said, "I am not proposing it as law. I am proposing it as the most efficient outcome for everyone, including the Koran Directorate, which has a significant interest in not being connected to an attempt to suppress an archive of this historical importance. The Directorate's recovery request went through official channels. That means it is documented. If the archive becomes public record, and the Directorate's attempt to recover the access mechanism becomes part of that record, the political question of why the Directorate wanted to suppress access will be very difficult to avoid." That particular silence lasted longer than the others. Kar said, "My clients will need to review this proposal." I said, "Your clients have time. I am not going anywhere." I ended the three-way call and reopened the line to Delta Sev alone. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did not sell it." I said, "No." He said, "I told you to sell it." I said, "You did. I thought your advice was sound for the situation you thought I was in. The situation turned out to be different." He said, You are aware that the people Carr represents do not typically accept a negotiated outcome, I said. I am aware of that. I am also aware that the people Carr represents are in a situation where any direct action against me makes the archive public immediately, because I have set up 6 encrypted transmissions on a time delay that release the full documentation to every major academic institution in the compact if I do not reset the timer every 48 hours. I set that up this morning. A pause, he said. You set that up this morning. I said. Yes, he said, very quietly. You bought it for 3 credits. I said. I did. He said. I want to hear this story from the beginning. The whole thing. I said. Buy me dinner sometime and I will tell you all of it. He made a sound I had never heard from him before. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was a laugh. A real one. Brief and dry. The kind that comes out when something surprises a person who had stopped expecting to be surprised. The Compact Historical Preservation Commission responded to my filing 7 hours later with a provisional acknowledgement and a request for a formal preservation consultation. The response was worded carefully, the way official language always is. But underneath, the careful language was something I had not expected to see from an institution. Urgency. They wanted to move quickly, which told me that the people inside that commission who understood what I had found were already working out the implications. The Corin Directorate filed a formal counterclaim 22 hours after that. It was dense and well argued, and it cited 11 separate sections of the Cultural Recovery Act. It also, and this was the part that mattered, did not claim ownership of the archive. It claimed procedural jurisdiction over the recovery process. Jurisdiction is not ownership. I had a legal scholar look at it that afternoon, a woman named Claire Austin who worked out of a neutral relay, and whom I paid by the hour, and Claire told me the counterclaim was aggressive but not strong, and that it would take 3 years to litigate, and that the Directorate probably knew that and was using it as leverage rather than expecting to win. Leverage only works if the other side has something to lose. I did not have much to lose. The disc was already in the registry. The archive was already documented. The commission was already involved. I told Claire to file a response acknowledging the Directorate's procedural interest and inviting them to participate in the commission's review process as an interested party. She said, "That will make them furious." I said, "It will give them a seat at the table." Furious people who have a seat at the table eventually become people who are invested in the table. It takes longer, but it works better. She looked at me for a moment through the comm screen with an expression I could not entirely read, and then she said she would handle the filing. Carr's clients made one more contact. Not through Carr this time, through a different intermediary, a woman named Petra who had the posture of someone who delivered messages for people she did not entirely trust and knew it. She said her clients remained interested in a private arrangement. She named a new figure, larger than the first one. She said her clients understood the situation and respected my position, and hoped we could find a mutually beneficial resolution. I said, "Tell your clients that the archive is not for sale, that the disc is not for sale, and that if they submit a formal application to the Compact Historical Preservation Commission like any other interested institution, I will make sure their application is processed with the same consideration as everyone else's." Petra paused in the way someone pauses when they know they are delivering a message that is not going to be received well. She said, "They may not accept that." I said, "They do not have to accept it. They just have to live with it." I reset the timer on my encrypted transmissions. The commission formal consultation was scheduled for 11 days out. I had cargo to run in the meantime, because I was still a courier with a schedule and bills to pay and a ship that needed fuel. I ran 2 jobs in those 11 days. Both routine, both legal, both entirely ordinary. I loaded and delivered and filed and collected, and it was all exactly as it had always been. And I sat in the Pharaoh's pilot seat in the quiet hours between one delivery and the next, and I held the disc in my palm and let it pulse. The commission consultation went 4 hours. It was formal and dense and covered legal ground I did not fully understand, until Claire explained it to me afterward. But the outcome was clear. The site was provisionally protected under Article 7. An administrative committee was formed. I was listed as consulting authenticator. The Commission's preliminary assessment, which they shared with me under confidentiality pending the formal announcement, described the archive as possibly the most significant historical discovery in 3 centuries of compact records. 3 centuries. I held the disk in my palm that night, sitting in the Pharaoh's cabin with the nav lights dimmed and the stars very quiet outside. And I thought about that vendor at the scrap stall, the 4-armed Vithali turning the disk in the light, not knowing what he held, the bin full of broken things, the 3 credits changing hands in a transaction so small that neither of us would have remembered it under ordinary circumstances. I opened my accounting system and transferred 3 credits into my operational account under the description: initial acquisition cost, disk, Vithali station. Then I looked at the consulting agreement the Commission had sent through. Claire had reviewed it. She had said the standard rate for this type of role, authenticated access to a unique historical site, was calculated as a percentage of the site's assessed institutional value, and that the assessed institutional value of the archive, based on the preliminary findings, was a number she had made me sit down before she told me. I thought about what that number meant for a while. I thought about my mother, who had spent her life coordinating other people's logistics, and my father, who had spent his life keeping machines running, and neither of them had ever had occasion to think about what it meant for a piece of property to be worth more than most planetary economies. I thought about Delthasev's laugh, brief and real and surprised. I said, out loud, to no one, to the cabin, to the disk in my hand, 3 credits. The disk pulsed, long and steady, the glass threads lit, the etchings cycling through their sequence, and for the first time I had the clear feeling that the object had been waiting not for someone to find the archive, but for the right someone to find it. Someone who would not sell it. Someone who would document first. Someone who would think of the table before thinking of the chair. I had no idea what that civilization had been like. I did not know their name. I did not know if they had been kind, or cold, or somewhere in the middle. I did not know what they had looked like, or how long they had lived, or what they had believed. But I knew they had built something, and sealed it, and made a key, and put that key out into the universe in a way that would eventually find the right pair of hands. I looked at my own hands, a courier's hands, practical, calloused, used to cold metal and cargo manifests, and the particular grip required to operate a loading dock control panel in low gravity. The disk sat in my palm and glowed quietly. I thought, all right, fair enough. Then I filed my next cargo pickup, ate a meal that was probably not technically meat, and went to sleep. Tomorrow I had work to do.